When I least expected, never say today. Do you know, just last week, I went down to Manchester with a friend. We were going down to a conference. And to be able to fit it in our busy schedule, we left after kids club. So we got in the car at 8:30 at night and travelled through the night to get to Manchester. And you know, it was pitch black the whole time. Now, normally I enjoy travelling down to England. I love it when you get to the Lake District and you see the mountains and the greenery and you can appreciate all that God has made. But there's something very different about travelling in the dark, isn't there? When you travel in the dark, you just see what the lights are shining on. You can't appreciate the creation that God has given us. You don't see the greenery, you don't see the animals, you just see the road. And you know, that got me thinking about life sometimes as well. Do you know, we know that there are amazing things in our lives, but in the hardest of times, in the darkest of times, sometimes we can just see the path ahead of us and we can't appreciate all that God has made. But of course, the night finishes, the daylight comes, and we can look on creation again. Do you know, I think that's so like the story of Joseph. Joseph had times where things were so hard and he maybe wasn't able to appreciate all that God had made. But you know, there were times in Joseph's life where the light just shone on it all. And I want to take us today to Genesis 41, starting at verse 46, and just want to share a few thoughts from Joseph. So let me start reading from verse 46 as we look at chapter 41. It says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traveled through the land of Egypt. Now here at this point in the story, we find that Joseph, he has been through getting sold as a slave. He has been through landing in jail, and now he is standing before Pharaoh. Do you know, in the Bible it tells us he was 17 when he received the coat from his dad, and now he's 30 years old and he's been through so much. I can't imagine what he must have thought as he stood there before Pharaoh the king, being able to interpret the dream that God had given him. It goes on in verse 47 to say, during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvests. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years and put it in all the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. And then it tells us in verse 50 that 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. Asnath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. You know, those words really stood out to me as Joseph declared, God has made me. You know, it tells us again and again in the Bible how God has made each one of us. Do you believe that you're fearfully and wonderfully made by God? Psalm 139 declares that he created us in our inmost being, that he knitted us together in our mother's womb. We're fearfully and wonderfully made, each one of us. It also tells us that God has made a way for each one of us in Jeremiah 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. God has a plan for each and every one of our lives. God has made each and every one of us. And here, Joseph declares in verse 31 that God has made me forget all my hardships and my whole family. You know, at this point in Joseph's life, he's lived through 13 years of hardship. 13 years where he was a servant, he was a slave, he was a prisoner. And yet, as he becomes a dad to this next generation, as he calls his son Manasseh, he is declaring that God has made him forget all his hardships. What a statement to declare to the next generation. If I were to ask you the question today, have you forgotten your hardships that you've been through in life? I think you don't have to live very long and there's a hardship or two comes your way. Do you know, I look back now over my life and I'm amazed at what God has taken me through. Let me take you back to a story. When I was just a young 22-year-old, I'd qualified as a school teacher, and I was excited about starting my teaching career. And at that point in time, there weren't a lot of permanent jobs. And I remember praying and fasting for a job, and God opened up a door in this school for me to go and to be a primary 6 teacher. I was absolutely delighted. But you know, if I knew what the job entailed, I'm not sure I would have applied for it. Because as I got there, I found that there were so many challenges within the class. And because I was so inexperienced in my ability to teach, I was overwhelmed at times. I found it challenging. I found myself out of my depth. Day upon day, I found each day so hard. But you know, I started that job in October and I survived. And that's the word, I survived to the summer. And you know, one of the things that kept me going was I knew that God's hand was upon my life. I knew that God had a plan for me. I knew and believed that God had placed me in that school. And I believe that when you have that belief that God has placed you somewhere, He also gives you the strength to be able to carry on through in the hardships. Do you know, as I came out in the summer, I went on to teach another 3 years in that school. I was surrounded by fantastic practitioners who encouraged, who helped me, who were mentors to me. And you know, after that 4 years working in that school, I actually came here to work in church. And you know, the hardship that I had experienced there, I had no idea the impact that it would have where I am today. Do you know, as I was leading the kids ministry and kids were coming in from all different primary schools and that ministry grew, there was never a situation that overwhelmed me because the training that I had experienced as a teacher fully equipped me for what God had got for me. I saw clearly the hand of God in that situation. Do you know, our hardships can have purpose. And Joseph was one of those characters in the Bible who continually experienced hardships for such a long time. He was wronged. He was wronged by his brothers. They lied about him. They put him in a pit. He was a slave. He was a prisoner. He was a foreigner. He was also forgotten. But you know, 13 years of hardship, I don't think this switch flipped overnight. I believe that during those 13 years that Joseph made a choice during his hard years to still be hardworking. It tells us when we read Genesis that Joseph was a good servant. He actually was in charge of the other servants. He was a hard-working man. It says in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, do it with all your heart unto the Lord and not unto man. I believe that Joseph took this stance. Even though things were hard, he still worked hard. He was also selfless, I think. He didn't benefit while he was being a servant. He didn't benefit when he was a prisoner. But yet, he didn't make it about himself. He still did what he could. Joseph was somebody that led small groups in the midst of the hardship. Can you believe that? He was in charge of the servants, it tells us. He was in charge of the prisoners. He was also somebody who was willing. You know, when I read the story of Joseph and I see the ups and the downs that he experienced, one of the stories that really stands out to me is when he interprets the dream of the cupbearer and the baker. And the cupbearer, he speaks to the cupbearer and he says, remember me when you're standing before Pharaoh. And then the Bible tells us that he was in prison for another 2 years because the cupbearer forgot about him. But yet, I believe that he still was willing and still worked hard, because when they called for him and said, Pharaoh would like to speak to you about interpreting his dream, Joseph didn't turn around and say, no, I'm not doing that. You've forgotten about me for 2 years. So since you didn't pick me up when I was ready, I'm just going to do my own thing, and I'm quite happy being a prisoner. Sometimes we can be like that, can't we? When we feel people have forgotten about us and that life has been so hard, sometimes we can get in our own way. But Joseph wasn't like that. He was willing to do what he could. He was willing to stand before Pharaoh, even though he'd been forgotten about for 2 years. He was also somebody who was willing to forgive, and Ben spoke about that last week. I believe that he had forgiven his brothers before he even seen his brothers. He forgave his brothers. He forgave Potiphar's wife for lying. I believe that he also forgave the cupbearer for forgetting about him. And you know, at this point in time, he's 30 years old. He has no idea how the story will end. He's no idea if he'll ever see his brothers again. He's no idea if he'll ever see his father. He's been through so much, and yet he declares, God has made me forget all, not some, but all my hardships. I am so glad that he didn't say that he was going to focus on his hardships. Do you see, if we don't forget our hardships, I think at times we can be in danger of focusing on our hardships. Do you know, Joseph didn't allow his hardships to define him. When he stood before the people of Egypt, he wasn't a prisoner or a slave. He'd been through those hardships. He actually became the second in command in Egypt, didn't he? And he was able to do amazing things. Do you know, he survived the hardships. And then he declared to the next generation, to his son, every time he said Manasseh, God has made me forget all my hardships. Do you know, C.S. Lewis says this, hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. What happens if we focus on our hardships rather than forget our hardships? Do you know, if we focus on our hardships, I believe that bitterness and resentment, unforgiveness can creep in. The feeling, I don't deserve this. This is just not right. And our attitudes can get in our way. And these things hurt. I know they do. Hardships are difficult. The trials of life can be so hard. But you know, when we see and when we allow God to carry us through, to strengthen us in the hardships, he can carry us to a place that we're able to say, like Joseph, God has made me forget my hardships. In John 16, verse 33, Jesus tells us there that in this world, couldn't I write it in the book? I've got somebody phoning me. I am now going to... Oh, coffee. You put it in airplane mode. Well, that is not helpful. How much minutes am I till already, Mark? I can't... It's not too long, is it? It's not. 30 minutes. Okay, we're not too long. Oh, govy. Right. God has made me... Right, well, I'll just go for the verse again. I'm rambling a bit more on Friday and Sunday. Jesus says in John 16, verse 33, that in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. There will be trouble here, but Jesus is here for us and here to help us. And we've got to be so careful that we don't allow bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness to creep into our lives. Do you know, in verse 31, Joseph declares, as his second son, Ephraim is born. He says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Ephraim in Hebrew means twice fruitful. At this point in time, Joseph has been given the job as second in command for at least a year. His son Manasseh was born before that, just after he was 30. He now has a second son, Ephraim. In Manasseh, he declared that God has made me forget all my hardships. Now, as his second son is born, he declares in this stage in his life that God has made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. What a declaration. Everything is going so well for Joseph. The barns are full. He now has a second son, and he is declaring in the land where he has personally, undeservingly experienced so much hardship and pain that God has made him fruitful. Wow. God has made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. If you've heard me sharing before, you'll know that I love a plant. And I've got a couple of plants here with me today. Do you know this plant? I think it's maybe been on show before. I've used it for a few illustrations. This plant here was actually planted in 2020. It was taken from lemon, and the seed was planted, lemon seed was planted, and it has been growing for the past 3 years. Do you know, the seed was planted, I've been watering it all the time for the last 3 years, and it's grown into what I think is quite a nice plant. And every year it gets a bit taller. It's survived the winter, so the leaves are looking a bit yellow down there. I know, for the green-fingered people out there, I know that we've lost a bit of colour, but it's just gotten through the winter. The leaves will come. You know, what I love about the lemon plant is when you rub the leaves, you also smell the scent of the lemons. And one day, this plant is going to bear fruit. There's going to be lemons on there. But it says it can take up to 5 years for there to be fruit on this tree. But this tree every day is breathing. This tree every day is growing. This tree every day gives off that scent of being a lemon. I also have another plant with me today, and it's this little lad down here. This is a plastic plant. I'm sure there's many of you have plastic plants in your house. These plastic plants are great. You don't have to look after them, do you? It looks absolutely perfect. It's such a nice thing to have in a room. But you know, this man-made plant will never grow. This man-made plant will never bear any flowers. This man-made plant will never produce any growth. Believe it or not, my lemon tree used to be the same size as this, but because this is real, it has grown. It's grown up past the plastic one. And you know, there are probably thousands of man-made plastic plants all over the UK. You maybe have one in your house. It is a lovely plant. But this got me thinking that as people that God has made and he's knitted us together and we're perfectly formed, are we allowing ourselves day by day to be man-made, or are we allowing ourselves to be God-made? Do you see, when man makes us, it looks picture perfect, but this doesn't actually have much function because it doesn't breathe and it won't grow. But you see, when God makes us, we grow even through the winter months. We will produce fruit in time, but we're not perfect. This tree is not symmetrical. This tree has got some leaves that are a little bit damaged. There's a leaf just around here. Look, this one, it's a little bit damaged. It's not perfect. But this tree, being God-made, will grow fruit. How is your life developing? Are you like Joseph and you can say, God has made me? Or are you thinking, man has made you? Joseph declared there that God had made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. In the land where there'd been so much pain, God had made him fruitful. Would he have experienced all that God had got for him if he'd stopped trusting and believing? Do you know, I have a friend who's written a book, and her name's Jane Mershon. She wrote a book back in 2020 called Adventure Awaits. And one of the quotes from her book that I have thought about many, many times is that she says, nothing grows on the mountaintop. Everything grows in the valley. The Bible tells us that he makes all things beautiful in his time. The growth does come, but sometimes it's in the valley. It's in the hardest of times. But God can mold us, shape us, prepare us for all that he has got for us. You know, we need to make sure that we are people who don't focus on our hardships, but that we are able to forget our hardships. That we are people who can be fruitful even in the land of our affliction. You know, we have quoted the verse Genesis 50, verse 20 many times over our Joseph series. And many times over the years, when Joseph declares to his brothers, what you meant for harm, God has meant for good. And you know, Joseph, when he met his brothers in Genesis, when he was 39 years old when he met his brothers, and as he stood there, he forgave them. As he stood there, he must have introduced his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And the brothers would have known as he introduced Manasseh, God has made him forget all his hardships. And as he introduced Ephraim, that God had made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. But you know, when he speaks to his brothers in Genesis 20, it's actually 17 years after that point that they have met for the first time. They've been living in Egypt for 17 years. The brothers had moved to Goshen. Joseph had met his dad. They had seen their family grow. And after his dad died, there's this problem with the brothers. Will Joseph put us out of the land? Will he not be happy with us again? 17 years after he first met his brothers, he has to declare again to his brothers that, look, it's okay. I'm not holding any grudges, because looking back at looking back at everything that had happened, what was meant for evil, God has used for good. Do you know, I don't know where you find yourself at today, but I want you to think 17 years from now. If you're in the middle of a hard period, if you're going through some stuff, can you believe that you will get like Joseph, to be able to look back and to declare what you meant for harm, God has used for good? Will you be able to see fruit in the land of your affliction? Let me take you to where you are now, to looking back 17 years ago. How has God molded you? How has God shaped you? How is God using your hardships in your everyday today? Do you know, I truly believe that we can get to the place, like Joseph, where we can declare that God has made us forget our hardships. We don't want to focus on the hardships. We can learn from the hardships. We develop from the hardships. But we want to get to the place where we can forget all our hardships, because God has made us who we are. And we want to be able to say 17 years later that God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Are you God-made this morning? Or are you being man-made and not reaching your potential? I want to pray for you wherever you're at today. There's that song that we love to sing that says, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of the earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. If you're going through hardship at this point, if you cannot see a way through, if you're not sure how the story will end, can I encourage you to turn your eyes upon Jesus, to look full in his wonderful face, and the things of the earth, the hardships, the hurt, the anxiety, the problems, the pain will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Lord, I thank you that we can come round your word and learn from you today. Lord, I pray, Lord, that we would be men and women, boys and girls that are God-made, that we are made by you. Lord, that we, Lord, see you there with us through the hard times. Lord, I pray for anybody watching just now, Lord, that is going through pain and hardship that seems so overwhelming. Lord, I pray and ask that you would just send your love and your comfort just to sweep over them, that they would know that you are with them, that you will never leave them. They just need to cry out to you. Lord, I pray for the pain that we experience, that it would be used for good. It would be used to encourage people. It would be used, Lord, to help us as we go on in life. Lord, I just ask you, bless each person watching. Amen.